Look, and I welcome the chance to discuss this legislation, and I acknowledge the huge work that's been put in by so many people to get to this point, to you, Minister, to your team and your officials, but especially to homeowners from Mayo Pyrite Action and the North Mayo Pyrite Group, from Mike Action Donegal, from Clare, Limerick, from Sligo. One of their representatives said last week that they've been ordinary homeowners put in an extraordinary situation, and they led an extraordinary response. And I think that should be acknowledged. But those who put them in that situation have yet to be pursued. And I was struck last week at the committee hearings at the lack of urgency around the appointment of a senior counsel into pursuing the avenues as to why this happened and to those who caused it. And I think far greater urgency needs to be invested in pursuing those and in pursuing that investigation. And when you consider that in the UK, €2 billion has been put on the table by the industry in relation to the cladding situation, that's the kind of response we need to see here. We need to see a contribution, not a levy, because a levy will be passed back, but a contribution from profits from some of the most profitable companies in the country to actually paying towards this, and indeed the other issues, the apartment defects issue as well. Minister, there are also a lack of response and a lack of engagement from the banks, who are among the ultimate winners of this, because they have the mortgages. The homeowners are paying banks for their homes. The banks own that asset, and they are very slow in cooperating, in assisting with homeowners who are in a situation of having pyrite in the block or having mica. And they've made it very difficult for homeowners. And similarly, insurance companies are welching out on contracts across the country because of the suspicion of pyrite or mica or pyrrhotite. And insurance companies and banks need to be brought to heel and told that they have to serve the people in relation to this. The government is putting its cards on the table here, and equally, Minister, we need to see a far greater engagement with companies such as that. Just briefly, a number of areas in relation to the bill. I have submitted to your office a detailed submission from Martina Hegarty and Josephine Murphy on behalf of the two Mayo groups in relation to the bill, which I know your office has received and is looking at. In relation to Section 5, Minister, while I welcome the inclusion of Limerick and Clare, the inclusion process is quite cumbersome. And the people of County Sligo in particular, who began the process at the same time as Clare, have been left waiting and wondering why they have been left aside. There needs to be some sort of assistance provided from your department to the relevant local authorities, because there is a reluctance on the part of local authorities to get involved in this. And there is also a complete lack of skills in many local authorities to actually engage in this. In relation to Section 8, the whole area, the definition of relevant dwellings, I think it's important, Minister, that all parts of the house should be included. There is a concern that some extensions may be excluded, and there's also the issue around garages, and there's a rather fancy word for garages and things like that. They equally will have defective blocks and are dangerous to those in the house, and they need to be included in the scheme. Similarly with boundary walls, I know you have given me a commitment that they will be included, but boundary walls onto public areas of housing estates also need to be included in the scheme. They offer a serious threat. In relation to Section 10 and 11, the whole area, the core area of grants, the FCSI process was detailed last March. It was published last March. That would assume that it's working about construction costs of November and January. That needs to be updated before the scheme goes live. Secondly, Minister, smaller homes will cost more per square metre than larger homes. And I think you need to look again at the hearings last week and the example from Martina Hegarty in a smaller house in a terrace where the costs are going to be greater, even though it's smaller. And just because you have a smaller house, you shouldn't be left out of pocket. The downsizing option is a very real option, and it needs to be given consideration. And one frustrating thing is that computer generally always says no when it comes to a lot of ideas. We need to think outside the box here, within the local authorities, within the departments around that, and give it some sort of consideration within the limitations. And finally, Minister, in the same way that you're introducing provision in this bill to fund local authority and AHB homes, there are also houses that are primary residence, say for instance for vulnerable adults, for people with disabilities, who are owned by a charity who do not have the resources to remediate their house. And similarly, a funding option should be made available either by yourself or by the Department of Health for those charities, so that those people do not lose their home in the same way that other homeowners won't lose their home. Minister, there's actually a major blockage at the moment in the scheme. There are people progressing, awaiting the conclusion of this, but the SEAI process in terms of giving people funding to upgrade the heating requirements has come to a complete halt. And I've been in contact with your office. We need an urgent update on that because there are people with houses demolished who are awaiting SEAI approval to proceed and can't because SEAI are saying that they cannot get clearance from their parent department, who are apparently talking to your department. And this is all it again. Silos, 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 not talking to anybody else. Meanwhile, the homeowner suffers. In relation to Section 12 about remediation options and building condition assessments, Minister, the committee hearings last week were hugely confusing. You had definite science on both sides of this argument. You had very definite people. And I know it's being reviewed, but there needs to be an urgency to the review of foundations. And I welcome Section 51, which triggers a review of the bill following the review of IS 465. But we need to give certainty in relation to foundations as soon as it's possible. And there was a presentation made by Thomas Campbell in relation to a potential solution around the foundation issue, a qualified engineer in this space, and I put that I forwarded that to your office. And also, I think that a commitment that there are homeowners who want to proceed, who want to get this over with, and that if they have to pay for their own foundations, that some sort of commitment should be given to funding that if the science stands up. Finally, Minister, the homeowner professional, the homeowner engineer, the homeowner architect needs to be part of the process too, because that is the only element of trust in all of this, and that's something that is needs to be stronger in the bill. Minister, I've spoken to you a lot about the damage threshold. I have serious concerns about it. We had a nightmare in Mayo last summer around a damage threshold, even though it didn't exist. And being excluded from the scheme was more stressful on homeowners than being told they had pyrite in the first place. There has to be, the 1.5 that's in the expert group is not based in any science, and I need to ensure that there be robust engagement with people around the damage threshold, and it's not used as an exclusionary medal. Finally, Ciara, just a couple of more things. Why are all the timelines in the bill all on the homeowners? There is no timeline on the local authority, there's no timeline on the housing agency, and in fairness to Bob Jordan, when I put that to him last week, he is committed to putting timelines and SLAs in place. But timelines need to go on every side of this as well. There needs to be provision, Minister, for force majeure cases, that there are cases that will not fit in to any of the definitions. There are older people in particular who proceeded ahead of the scheme to remediate their houses for family safety reasons, and they need to be given some sort of recognition. And finally, Minister, I do acknowledge the huge changes. It's important to acknowledge that, because that's getting lost in the argument here today, that this is a very different scheme from where it was this time last year. But to make it the kind of scheme that works, we need to engage strongly in the regulations, because those regulations made it inaccessible on the last occasion. And we need to strongly engage around some of the amendments that have been put forward.
Right. Thanks, Deputy.